Imagine this. Your loved one is struggling to breathe, every second counting between life and death. The ambulance is rushing to your home. Help is just moments away. But then, it stops. Blocked. Not by traffic, not by an accident, but by a person. A woman who believes her rules are more important than a life. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned, because this is a real story of entitlement, power, and a shocking downfall that no one saw coming. Let's dive in. The sound of sirens echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood as the ambulance raced down the street, its red and blue lights flashing urgently. Inside the house at the end of the block, James was lying on the floor, struggling to breathe. His wife, Emily, had already called 911, her voice shaking as she pleaded for them to hurry. Every second felt like an eternity. Their young daughter, Lily, clung to her mother's side, tears streaming down her face as she watched her father gasping for air. The paramedics were their only hope, but just as the ambulance turned onto their street, it came to an abrupt halt. A figure stood in the middle of the road, arms crossed, a scowl on her face. It was Karen, the self-proclaimed head of the Homeowners Association, HOA. She waved her hands angrily at the emergency vehicle, refusing to move. The paramedics honked the horn, signaling for her to get out of the way. But Karen didn't budge. Instead, she marched up to the driver's side window, her face twisted with annoyance. "You can't park here. This is a private neighborhood, and HOA rules clearly state that no emergency vehicles are allowed to enter without prior approval," she snapped, her voice dripping with entitlement. The paramedics exchanged bewildered looks. One of them, a young woman named Jake, rolled down the window and tried to reason with her. "Ma'am, there's a medical emergency. We need to get through." But Karen was unmoved. "I don't care. These are the rules, and if I let you break them now, what's stopping everyone else from doing the same?" She huffed, glancing down at her clipboard as if she was conducting some official business. Meanwhile, inside the house, Emily's panic deepened. James's breathing was becoming weaker, his face pale. She clutched her phone, watching the ambulance stop just a few houses away. "Why aren't they coming?" she muttered, rushing to the front door. When she saw Karen standing there, blocking the path, rage surged through her. She stormed down the front steps, her heart pounding. "Get out of the way, Karen!" she shouted, her voice trembling with desperation. But Karen simply scoffed. "I don't take orders from rule breakers," she said smugly. "If your husband is really sick, you should have planned better." Jake had had enough. She threw open the ambulance door, stepping out with determination. "Move now, or I'll call the police," she warned, her tone firm. But Karen simply smirked. "Go ahead. I'm on the HOA board. I know my rights." The paramedics could see precious time slipping away. They knew they had to act fast. But dealing with someone as stubborn and entitled as Karen was never easy. The standoff continued, and inside the house, James's condition was worsening by the second. Emily's hands trembled with fury as she clenched her phone, her knuckles turning white. She had no time for Karen's nonsense, not when her husband was fighting for his life. Without hesitation, she dialed 911 again. "My husband can't breathe, and the ambulance is stuck because a woman from our HOA is blocking the street. You need to send the police now," she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. The dispatcher assured her that officers were on the way, but Emily knew they might not arrive in time. Every second mattered. She turned back to Karen, her eyes burning with desperation. "Karen, please. My husband could die. Just move out of the way," she pleaded, her voice raw with emotion. But Karen remained unmoved, shaking her head with an air of superiority. "Rules are rules," she sniffed. "If I let this slide, what's stopping others from taking advantage? Next thing you know, we'll have ambulances parked all over the place." Inside the ambulance, Jake and her partner, David, exchanged a look. They had seen difficult people before, but this was beyond anything they had dealt with. Every moment wasted arguing with Karen was a moment James didn't have. Jake took a deep breath, stepping closer to the stubborn woman. "If you don't move right now, you could be responsible for someone's death," she said, her tone sharp with urgency. Karen simply scoffed. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. If it were really that serious, they should have just driven him to the hospital instead of wasting resources." Jake's patience snapped. She turned to David. "Get the stretcher. We're running the rest of the way." David jumped into action, pulling the stretcher from the back of the ambulance. Without wasting another second, he and Jake started sprinting toward the house, pushing past Karen without another glance. The entitled woman gasped in outrage, yelling after them, "You can't do that! You're violating HOA policy!" But the paramedics didn't stop. Emily met them at the front door, practically dragging them inside. "Please hurry! He's barely conscious," she cried. Jake knelt beside James, assessing his condition. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. She quickly pulled out an oxygen mask, fitting it over his face. "Stay with me, sir," she urged, as she and David worked swiftly to stabilize him. Outside, Karen was still fuming. She whipped out her phone, dialing the HOA president. "I want these paramedics fined for trespassing," she barked. But before she could finish her complaint, the distant sound of sirens filled the air once again. The police had arrived. 2 patrol cars pulled up, and officers stepped out, surveying the scene. Karen marched toward them, smugly pointing at the ambulance. "I need you to remove this vehicle immediately. It's disrupting our peaceful community," she demanded. But the officers weren't listening to her. Instead, they turned their attention to Jake and David, who were now wheeling James out of the house. One of the officers approached Emily. "Ma'am, are you okay? We got a call about someone blocking emergency services." Emily nodded frantically, pointing at Karen. "She stopped them from getting to my husband. He could have died because of her." The officer's expression darkened. He turned to Karen, his stance firm. "Ma'am, is this true? Did you prevent emergency responders from assisting a critically ill person?" Karen huffed, crossing her arms. "I was enforcing HOA rules. They should have gotten proper clearance before barging in here." The officer's jaw tightened. "Interfering with emergency services is a serious offense," he said, reaching for his handcuffs. Karen's smug expression finally wavered as she realized what was happening. "Wait, what are you doing?" she stammered, stepping back. But it was too late. The officer grabbed her wrists, locking the cuffs around them with a sharp click. "Karen Thompson, you're under arrest for obstruction of emergency personnel," he stated firmly. Karen's eyes widened in horror. "This is outrageous! You can't do this to me! I'm on the HOA board!" she shrieked as the officers led her to the patrol car. Meanwhile, the paramedics secured James in the ambulance, his breathing steadier, but still weak. Emily climbed in beside him, gripping his hand tightly as they sped toward the hospital. Tears streamed down her face, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over her. She couldn't believe how close she had come to losing him, all because of Karen's absurd obsession with rules. As the ambulance disappeared down the road, the officers finished taking statements from the neighbors who had witnessed the ordeal. Many of them shook their heads in disbelief. "I always knew she was bad," one man muttered. "But this is a new low." Karen, still handcuffed in the back of the patrol car, glared out the window, seething with rage. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath. But for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt a little bit safer without her standing in the way. The ambulance sped toward the hospital, its sirens wailing into the night. Inside, Emily held tightly onto James's hand, watching anxiously as the paramedics monitored his vitals. His breathing was still labored, but at least he was stable for now. Jake adjusted the oxygen mask, her expression calm but focused. "You got to him just in time," she reassured Emily. "He's strong, but we need to get him to the ER as soon as possible." Emily swallowed hard, her mind still reeling from what had just happened. If they had been delayed even a few minutes more, she didn't want to think about what could have happened. All because of Karen, someone who had lived just down the street, someone who was supposed to be a neighbor. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, the scene outside Karen's house was growing more intense. The police officers had already placed her in the back of the patrol car, but her shrill voice could still be heard through the cracked window. "I am the head of the HOA. You can't do this to me," she screeched. The officers exchanged tired looks. One of them, Officer Reynolds, sighed as he turned back to the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered to witness the spectacle. "Has she always been like this?" he asked. A man named Tom, who had lived in the neighborhood for years, shook his head. "Worse," he muttered. "She fines people for parking in their own driveway. She once had a kid's lemonade stand shut down because it didn't fit HOA guidelines." Another neighbor, a woman named Lisa, crossed her arms. "She's been out of control for years. But this? Blocking an ambulance? That's a new level of crazy." Inside the patrol car, Karen was still fuming. She yanked at the cuffs around her wrists, her mind racing for a way out of this mess. "This is harassment," she spat. "I was only following the rules. This is my neighborhood. They should be arresting that paramedic for trespassing." But Officer Reynolds wasn't listening to her anymore. He was speaking to his partner, confirming that Karen was facing serious charges: obstruction of emergency services, reckless endangerment, and possibly even negligence resulting in harm. "You can fight it in court," he said, finally turning back to her. "But from what I've seen tonight, you're in a lot of trouble." As the neighbors stood outside watching Karen being taken away, a sense of relief washed over them. Many of them had lived in fear of her for years, constantly afraid of violating one of her ridiculous HOA rules. But tonight, she'd finally crossed a line that no one could ignore. Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what's going to happen to her, but I hope this means we can finally have some peace around here." Lisa nodded. "She deserves everything that's coming to her. No one should have the power to put lives at risk over rules." At the hospital, James was rushed into the ER while Emily waited anxiously outside his room. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before a doctor finally emerged. He smiled gently. "Your husband is gonna be okay," he assured her. "It was a close call, but he's stable now. He'll need some rest, but he's out of immediate danger." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you." She was beyond grateful. To the paramedics, to the doctors, and to the officers who had stepped in when things had nearly gone too far. But as she sat by James's bedside, exhaustion settling into her bones, she couldn't help but wonder. What would happen next? Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. Would she find a way to manipulate her way out of this? Or was this finally the end of her reign of control over the neighborhood? The night stretched on as Emily sat beside James's hospital bed, her fingers intertwined with his. He was still weak, but awake now, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I thought I wasn't going to make it," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Emily squeezed his hand gently. "You're here. That's all that matters," she whispered. But deep down, she was still fuming. She couldn't stop replaying the image of Karen standing in the middle of the road, blocking the ambulance like she had some divine right to control who lived and who died. The sheer arrogance, the absolute selfishness, it made Emily's blood boil. She had always known Karen was unreasonable. But this? This was something else entirely. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Karen sat in an interrogation room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was a mixture of fury and disbelief. She still couldn't comprehend what had happened. Her, arrested? The head of the HOA? It was unthinkable. She had spent years running the neighborhood with an iron grip, controlling every little detail, making sure everything was perfect. And now, because of one ungrateful family and a couple of overreacting paramedics, she was sitting in jail? This couldn't be happening. The door creaked open, and Officer Reynolds stepped inside, a file in his hand. He sat across from her, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "Karen Thompson, you're being charged with obstruction of emergency services and reckless endangerment," he stated plainly. Depending on the outcome of James Bennett's condition, those charges could increase. Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, please," she spat. "This is ridiculous. I was simply enforcing HOA policy. That ambulance had no right to be there." The officer's expression remained neutral. "No right?" he echoed. "A man was dying in his own home, and you think your rules matter more than his life?" Karen huffed, looking away. "It's about maintaining order," she insisted. "If we start letting ambulances just barge in whenever they want, what's next? Fire trucks? Police? This is a private community." Officer Reynolds let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you?" he said. "This isn't about rules. This is about human decency. And from where I'm sitting, you don't have an ounce of it." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "You could have killed that man, Karen, and I don't think a single person in your neighborhood is going to stand up for you this time." For the first time, Karen's confidence wavered. She had always believed she was untouchable, that no matter what, she could talk her way out of anything. But now she wasn't so sure. Back in the neighborhood, news of Karen's arrest spread like wildfire. The HOA members held an emergency meeting, and for the first time in years, people spoke freely about their frustrations. "She's terrorized us for too long," Lisa said, slamming her hand on the table. "It's time for a change." Tom nodded in agreement. I say we vote her out. Strip her of her position and make sure she never has this kind of power again." A murmur of approval spread through the group. Karen had ruled through fear for years, but tonight had proven that no one, not even her, was above the law. At the hospital, James drifted into a peaceful sleep, his breathing steady. Emily brushed a hand over his forehead, relief finally settling into her chest. But she knew this wasn't over. Karen might be behind bars now. But what would happen next? Would she find a way to slither out of the consequences, as she always had before? Or was this truly the beginning of the end for her reign of control? 2 days later, Emily pushed open the door of their home, guiding James carefully inside. He was still weak, but his condition had stabilized, and the doctors assured them that with rest, he would make a full recovery. Lily ran up to him, wrapping her tiny arms around his waist, her eyes filled with relief. "Daddy, you're home!" she cried. James smiled, his voice still raspy but filled with warmth. "I am, sweetheart." Emily exhaled deeply. After everything they had been through, just being back together as a family felt like a miracle. But she knew they weren't the only ones whose lives had changed that night. Across the neighborhood, the HOA board had officially voted to remove Karen from her position. The decision was unanimous. There was no debate, no hesitation. The community had tolerated her pettiness for years, but blocking an ambulance had been the final straw. As soon as the vote was finalized, an email went out to all residents. Effective immediately, Karen Thompson has been removed as HOA president and will no longer have any authority over neighborhood policies. A wave of relief swept through the community. People who had once lived in fear of Karen's arbitrary rules and excessive fines finally felt free. Some even gathered in the park that evening, chatting and laughing, celebrating the end of an era. Karen, however, was nowhere to be seen. After spending a night in jail, she had been released on bail, but the charges against her were still pending. Rumors swirled that she had locked herself inside her house, too ashamed to face the neighbors. Some people speculated that she was planning to move away. Others believed she was waiting for an opportunity to reclaim control. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Karen's power was gone. And without her ability to control and intimidate, she was just another disgraced neighbor with no one left to listen to her. Emily sat on the porch that night, sipping a cup of tea as she watched Lily play in the yard. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No one was watching their every move, waiting to issue a fine for a misplaced trash can or an unauthorized holiday decoration. They were finally free to live their lives without fear of a power-hungry tyrant dictating their every move. James joined her, sitting carefully in the chair beside her. "Do you think she's learned her lesson?" he asked. Emily let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Karen? Not a chance." She glanced toward the end of the street, where Karen's house sat in eerie silence. "But at least now, she doesn't get to decide how we live our lives." The night breeze was cool, carrying with it a sense of closure. The nightmare was over. Karen had finally faced the consequences of her actions, and the neighborhood had come together stronger than ever. As Emily leaned her head against James's shoulder, she knew that no matter what happened next, they had won. And for the first time in a long time, the future looked bright. In the end, Karen's obsession with control led to her downfall. No one is above basic human decency, And when power is used to harm rather than help, it will eventually be taken away. Message for readers, viewers. True power lies not in control, but in kindness and community. Never let rules overshadow humanity.